Hello, esteemed colleagues, guests, and friends. I would like to warmly welcome you to the fifth panel of the online commemorative conference on Zehou. This penultimate panel will include three presentations on three different, yet still mutually interrelated aspects of Li's philosophy, ranging from his reading of Chinese traditional sources and comments to the overlapping aspects between Li's and Fuguan's concept of shamanism, and finally, to his reading of Kant's philosophy of mathematics. I would like to use this opportunity to remind all the presenters that their talks should not exceed 15 minutes. Although we do understand that 15 minutes is very short, we would encourage both the authors as well as the audience to address the under-discussed aspects of their talks during the discussion section, which will follow the presentations. We would also like to let all the participants know that the conference is being recorded. So let me first introduce the first speaker of this panel, who is, I believe, well known to everyone amongst us. He is Professor Paul J. D'Ambrosio, who is currently a professor of philosophy and Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai. He's also a Morning Star Scholar and the Dean of the Center of Intercultural Research, Translating and Teaching. His research specializations include Chinese philosophy, comparative philosophy, ethics, and conceptions of the self. He is also the author, co-author, and translator of several monographs relating to different topics in Chinese philosophy. Please, Professor D'Ambrosio, the stage is all yours.
Okay, thanks. I promise shorter than 15 minutes. So, okay. I want to thank, you guys can all see my screen, right? Yeah, great. All right, so I want to thank everyone who organized this, especially Yana and Maja. Probably Teo was involved a lot, and I'm sure lots of other people. So thank you everyone who was involved. My presentation is about understanding Li Zehou and the tradition of masters and commentators. So it actually starts off with frustration. I think if you've worked on Li Zehou, but probably especially if you've translated Li Zehou, you realize that he can be extremely frustrating to work with. So I think both in style and content, right? But this is especially true, at least for me, in his analysis of Western philosophy, right? So a lot of what he says about anything from the Greeks and Kant and Nietzsche and Heidegger up to Sandel, and maybe Sydney will talk about this in terms of Kant later, is very puzzling. It can be misleading, or honestly, it can just be plainly inaccurate. So for example, when I first worked on right, a response to Michael Sandel and other matters. When I first worked on this translation with Robert Carlio, we would often joke that the more appropriate title would just be 记起他, right, and other matters, because it didn't have that much to do with Sandel. And a lot of times, for example, his correctives to Sandel's arguments were actually Sandel's arguments. Right, so he wasn't so much correcting Sandel as just rewording Sandel. And that made me think a lot, like, you know, is he actually that good of a scholar? Like, what's going on here, right? Did he misread Sandel? Did he not understand Sandel? Did he not care about Sandel? I was very confused and frustrated, right? It started off with frustration and then sort of led to more confusion. So I think we can, so in this way, sorry, this is blocked here. Let me just minimize it then. So in this way, I think we can understand, I think we're better off understanding Li Zehou viewed from the perspective of his own intellectual tradition, which I think can be very well classified as a tradition of masters and commentators. So viewed within this intellectual tradition, I think we gain a much fuller appreciation of Li Zehou's work. He's a sometimes master, sometimes commentator, which I would say all the so-called masters and commentators are as well, right? They're not exclusively masters or commentators. And then, so recognizing this, I think allows us to really appreciate Li Zehou's philosophy much better. So for example, like a commentator, he unabashedly presents very particular readings of different passages, for example, in the Analects or different aspects of Zhuangzi, etc. They're very much one-sided sometimes, but they're always in the service of the development of his own philosophical theory. And that, I think, is very important to note. Like a master, Li Zehou does not provide narrow responses to narrow problems. If you've read his work, you find, there's not a lot of strictly logical arguments. Sometimes there's not even arguments. So I think then his ideas function best when they're taken as starting points for further discussion and as outlines for responding to various and dynamic issues. So today, when we say philosophy, usually what we mean is actually academic philosophy. For those outside of the discipline, this largely lives in an ivory tower. And by the way, I think that conception is for the most part accurate, right? A lot of academic philosophy speaks in very highfalutin, grandiloquent language. It relies very heavily on methods abounding in the abstract and the absolute. And yet the issues that we deal with are common parts of everyday life, or at least they should be. And life itself is concrete and nuanced, right? It happens in the nitty-gritty details of complex social relations. It happens with, through, and by persons who are incongruent and multifarious. So I think when we talk about philosophy, right, the sort of like philosophical heroes that we normally reference, some of the most inspiring works, for example, of Plato, of Confucius, of Nietzsche, of Zhuangzi, of Kant, they all share in sort of opening the world to us, right? They make the world bigger. They make problems bigger. They show us different perspectives. They take what's familiar to us and they make it strange. So they broaden the world. But our academic practice narrows things, right? Write a paper on friendship in the Analects. Okay, what does that mean? Isolate this issue. Anything that surrounds it, don't include that, right? And you have this very sort of nitpicky, like you're using needle nose pliers sort of extraction of something very small and discussing it. So the work that we deal with broadens the world for us, but I think for the most part, academia makes the world smaller, makes the world more narrow. So in this presentation, I want to celebrate Li Zehou for all the frustration that he gave me. And I think that he's given to many others, because I think that frustration comes from him being a really good philosopher, which in part is due to his being not a great academic. So that would be my argument, is he's, in a lot of ways, he's not really that good of an academic. And that's actually what makes him such a great philosopher. Another example is, I'm very interested in Weijin Xuanxue, right? And I had read, like Lu Xun, Tong Yung Tong. I read all these great works. I read some of the primary texts. I read great works about Weijin Xuanxue. And then I got Li Zehou's book. And I thought, okay, this is going to be excellent, right? Now I'm going to have another perspective. Instead, what I find in this short book, I mean, the book is short, like actually short, right? It's not very tall, right? And it's kind of skinny. So the pages don't have that many words on them. And there's only like 17 pages on Weijin Xuanxue. And I think, how the heck is he going to do this? And then all Li Zehou really writes is that Weijin Xuanxue is a Zhuangzi-based attitude, or fengdu, right? And then he just has some really sparse comments about He Yan, Wang Bi, Guoxiang, and the seven worthies of the bamboo grove. So if you are just starting to learn about Weijin Xuanxue, this book is basically useless, or these 17 pages, right? They're useless. However, if you're familiar with Weijin Xuanxue, if you read the primary text, secondary text will help you too. But if you read the primary text and then you read Li Zehou and you're like actually someone who thinks and reflects, I think there's no way you don't go back and reread those texts and see something different. And that's, I think, the value of Li Zehou's philosophy. That's how it functioned for me, and I think that's how it functions for a lot of people as well. Also, we can find examples, right, that he uses, instead of sort of straightforward treatises, he talks about, for example, he writes essays, he writes outlines, he gives readings. And then later in his life, he wrote interviews. Of course, there are interviews with Li Zehou, but many of the interviews or many of the texts that are interviews are not actual interviews, they're just him writing himself, right? And Deng Delong, who was a longtime friend and founder and a funder of a lot of the English translation of Li Zehou's work, described this to me because I did naively think they were actual interviews for quite a while. And he said, Professor Li has turned to interviews as a method of philosophical writing, right? So it's like the dialogues, Plato's dialogues. He's tired of trying to prove his ideas. It's easier to write this way for Li. He's old and he's not that much interested in academia. And I think, again, sort of like appreciating this allows you to see how Li Zehou's, like the content is in the method, and it allows you to see how his thought sort of functions and what you can do, I think, a lot of times with it. So again, today, academic philosophy asks us to write very clear, logical, and tightly argued structures. There's little variance, I think, in what's considered acceptable. But again, our philosopher heroes, right? Plato, Nietzsche, Confucius, Zhuangzi, nothing that they write would really pass the blind review process, right? Or I think even as a book, right? They would pass any of these review processes. But even more interesting than that, I think that's a point that many people have made, right? That they write in a very different style, and then people say, oh, well, today we just do things differently. Okay, fair enough. But I also challenge that I think Plato, Nietzsche, Confucius, Zhuangzi, Kant, etc., they would hate basically everything written today about them. I don't want to offend anyone, but I'm pretty sure that everything I've written about Confucius himself wouldn't really like. And that everything I wrote about Zhuangzi or the authors of the Zhuangzi, I don't think they would like this very much either. And I think that's an important point to think about when we approach Li Zehou's philosophy, because a lot of what he writes is not, by Western academic standards, is not very much acceptable either. And we see this also, for example, in the concepts that he discusses, right? He talks, for example, about Guanxism, he talks about emotion as substance, emotional rational structures, theory of two morals. And these are all concepts that, like Yana, Bobby, myself, right? All these people, we argue about what they mean, how to translate them, all kinds of things. And I think, again, this shows us Li Zehou, the philosopher, right? One of the ideas that I've worked on a lot is harmony being higher than justice, right? And when he asks himself in an interview what that means, he says, I can't explain it, right? And why can't he explain it? Because it involves a lot of different things, right? He says we need to get political philosophers involved. We need to get psychologists involved. We need to get people from religion involved. We need specialists to come together and talk about these things, right? And you can view this as arrogant, but if you know Li Zehou, you know that it's not arrogant, right? He's not saying, I'm so smart and now other people have to talk about it. He's saying, look, this is how the world is, or this is a view of the world, and let's get together and have a discussion, right? And I think that that's a really great way of doing philosophy. And I don't know about other people, but when I just look at like this photo, like when you look at Li Zehou, at least to me, you think about conversation, right? You think about talking, and you don't think about someone just presenting their ideas. And I think that's a really great way to do philosophy. So I'm just going to skip this so that we can have more time. And I'll just end by saying that contemporary academic philosophy, I think, is unlikely to admit, for the most part, that there are perhaps more truths, whatever that might mean, or more insights into human interaction, perhaps better reflections on living in the works, for example, of Tolstoy than in Plato's dialogues. But for those who believe in the possibility of literature outdoing contemporary academic philosophy, right? Or we could even say in discussions having priority over academic articles. Or for those who are in favor of not speaking sometimes, as Li Zehou often did, right? He was a great listener. Or at hinting over explanation, I think Li Zehou is a true philosopher. Like Confucius, like Plato, Nietzsche, or Zhuangzi, If we apply current academic standards, Li is definitely lacking. But when we read him contextualized in the master and commentator tradition, and we read him in the sort of Jing and Tren style, I think we really come to appreciate the breadth and the consequence of his style of philosophizing with texts rather than merely philosophizing on them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor D'Ambrosio, for sharing your very insightful and enlightening frustrations with Li Zehou with us, especially for being astoundingly concise and punctual. I'm sure that we will have much to discuss later. Now I will go to the second speaker of this panel, who is also well known to us all. She is my colleague from University of Ljubljana, namely Maja Maria Kosec, who is currently studying as a junior researcher and a doctoral candidate at the University of Ljubljana, of course under Professor Roschker. Her research is centered around the philosophy of Li Zehou and Fuguan. The title of her presentation will be titled "The Origins of Chinese Culture and the Question of Shamanism, Li Zehou and Fuguan." Maja, please.
Thank you, Jan. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Roschker and to Professor Ames for allowing me to speak here today, to be able to be part of that and commemorate Professor Li Zehou at this really meaningful gathering. So as Jan just said, I'm currently working on a comparison of paradigms of Li Zehou and Fuguan, focusing on their understanding of the key concepts of Confucian ethics and their evaluation of the role and contribution of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou to the process of shaping Chinese culture. In today's presentation, I will compare Li Zehou to Fuguan, also known as one of the representatives of the second generation of modern New Confucians, the stream of thought that also to some extent influenced Li Zehou's work, as we know. As Professor D'Ambrosio just exposed, contemporary philosophy professors usually write with very little variance in what is acceptable to academic standards. And in terms of this type of style is, as we saw and as we will see, often lacking. So in order to evaluate Li Zehou's theory of the shamanistic historical tradition in the context of his time, I will try to offer a critical comparison of his and Fuguan's beliefs on the origin of Chinese culture. As Li needs no further introduction, I will just shortly introduce Fuguan. So Xu was born in China in 1903. He studied under Xiongshili and later devoted himself to philosophy, sociology of culture, literary and art criticism, and became famous above all as one of the first theorists of a specifically Chinese aesthetics in contemporary China. He is now considered one of the representatives of the second generation of modern New Confucians. So based on textual analysis, Li Zehou and Fuguan developed their own views on the origins of the roles of religious and political authority, the reasons for merging of these two roles in Chinese history, and the impact of these early rulers on further development of Chinese culture. The many similarities in Li's and Xu's understanding of these merged roles are accompanied by their differing views on whether or not these early rulers were also shamans. My presentation today will focus on the key elements of their theories and the implications of the differences between them for their understanding of Chinese culture. I will also analyze the views of both authors on the role and position of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou during a time when China slowly moved away from religion and into the realm of humanism and ethics. As we will see, their methodological starting point is basically quite the opposite. While Xu believes that researchers of intellectual history should start with the tangible, that is with the written text, and move toward the abstract, so towards the thought, they should start from the abstraction of thought and then turn to the concrete reality of human life. Li claimed that one can write history of thought in two ways, historically or philosophically, and that these correspond to the respective methods of my thought commentating on the classics or the classics commentating on my thought. He said, regrettably, to this day I remain able to write only to the method of the classics, commentating on my thought, fabricating concepts and providing perspectives with which to examine the phenomena of our world. End of quote. These differences can simultaneously serve as exposition of certain discursive or paradigmatic differences between the work of a philosopher on one hand and a historian on the other. So let us examine how these methodological clues are reflected in Li's and Xu's interpretation of the origins of Chinese culture. To put the discussion in a broader context, theoretically, let us mention the theory of axial age. So many Chinese scholars believe that during what Karl Jaspers calls the axial age, China transitioned from the period of natural religion to the period when the ethics of humanism were prominent. This breakthrough that Jasper understands as a breakthrough toward transcendence was actually a breakthrough toward humanities in case of China. So regarding the question, what were the reasons for this breakthrough and what consequences it had for further shaping of Chinese culture and history? Of course, the ideational and philosophical explanation differ greatly between different streams of thought and between different authors. The modern New Confucians, for example, have seen the human being as an immanent and a transcendent one. Zehou, on the other hand, does not rely on the same hypothesis and describes the worldview that he believes prevailed in Chinese tradition as a one worldview, which he believes developed from a rationalized form of shamanism and means that there is only one world. That would be the world in which we live. Based on this belief, Li sharply criticized modern New Confucians and their concept of immanent transcendence, and of course their notion of double ontology. The differences in Xu's and Li's interpretation of the roles of political and religious rulers in the early Zhou period originate in their different interpretations of the developments that took place in this time that Jaspers calls the axial age. So first I would start with Fuguan. In his historically based theory, Xu claims that Zhou people brought the culture previously based on material achievements into the realm of ideas. He says that through awakening to one's own responsibility, Zhou developed a sense of concerned consciousness. The doubt about the mandate of heaven gradually freed people from dependence on religion and led the Chinese towards the formation of a humanistic spirit of Chinese morality. Since it was still too early in the early Zhou era to completely break away from religion, people began to understand the mandate of heaven through King Wan. Therefore, his relationship with the divine went beyond the role of a mediator, and King Wan actually became a representation of God. Here Xu quotes a little passage from the book of poetry, which says, "Take your pattern from King Wan, in the myriad regions will repose confidence in him." But since King Wan did not focus on heaven, he was primarily concerned with the problems of the present world. And Xu believes that the concept of concerned consciousness, Yaopanisha, as an expression of the awakening humanistic spirit of China, originated with him, so with King Wan. But it then further developed under his successor, his son, Duke of Zhou, and it was finally integrated into classical Confucianism under Confucius. Quite the opposite from Xu's concept of concerned consciousness, I believe, is Li's concept of culture of joy. So Li bases his theory on the one worldview, as we mentioned, and rejects the possibility of existence of any higher transcendental world. Li believes that as Chinese tradition did not focus on search for a higher meaning in order to reach a higher transcendental world, its way of searching for ethical and social rules was more joyful. This feeling of joy, legan, refers to a range of emotions that were a necessary precondition for the emergence of humaneness, which developed from the union of material and spiritual life. As Li explains, early shamanistic ceremonies played an extremely important role in this process, and it is precisely the understanding of discontinuation of the rationalized form of shamanism that became key to understanding Chinese thought and culture. Ancestor worship and the worship of celestial gods gradually converged and intermingled giving rise to the paradigm of the post-Shang Chinese religion. And with this gradual integration of god worship and ancestor worship, the integration of religious and political authority also took place. As for this part, the theory of Li Zehou and Xu Fuguan actually is quite similar. They agree on what is written here. So what Li then does is that he connects the role of the shaman with the role of a king, and with the king's power or the ruler's power over divination. So he interprets King Wen as one of the last shaman kings, and more importantly, as one of the pioneers of rationalization of shamanistic practices. He puts this as an example that he takes from Ji. He says, when King Wen makes sacrifice, his serving the dead was equivalent to serving the living. And he uses that as a proof that King Wen was actually a shaman. So since the cultivation of human emotion was equated with the understanding of music during this period, which can also be referred to with the same notion, le gan wen hua, but translated as the culture of music and aesthetics, Zhou dynasty rituality began to represent a system of regulations which, through guiding people with social norms, sustained the social order. Through ritual and music, the Duke of Zhou then comprehensively rationalized and institutionalized the shamanistic ritual ceremonies of sacrificial ancestor worship and communication with the spirit that guided human affairs. This unification of government and religion then served as a normative criteria of the social order that characterized Zhou culture. It was Confucius who later rooted ritual in humaneness, finally completing the process of rationalization of shamanism. Xu and Li both believe that the close connection between religion and politics in China originated in the practice of ancestor worship, and that the Shang and the early Zhou periods had the highest religious role, that of the person responsible for serving the ancestors, was given to the political leader, so to the king. They also agree that during the Zhou dynasty, shamans evolved into the historians, which you can see from the quotations. However, this interpretation of how this occurred differs greatly from Xu Fuguan's. While Xu firmly rejects the idea that the kings of the Zhou period may also have been shaman, Li posits two different theories. In the first, he identifies the early auxiliary rulers with shaman officials, as proposed by Zhang Binglin, while in the second, he asserts that the early kings were also the supreme shamans, as proposed by the Chinese archaeologist Chen Mengjia. So, although these two theories, it's actually the same theory presented in two different works and interpreted a little bit differently. So these two explanations do not necessarily oppose one another, but they never appear together. So, for example, in the case of the Duke of Zhou, it is a little bit unclear if he sees him as a shaman official, so as an auxiliary ruler, or actually as a shaman king, so the main ruler of the dynasty. But as said, that is not the main problem. The bigger issue is that in Li's theory about the Chinese shamanistic tradition, he relies almost entirely on Chen Mengjia. Chen Mengjia was a Chinese archaeologist from the first half of the 20th century, and he wrote, "The king himself, although a political leader, was also the community's head shaman." This assumption is problematic on several levels. Since Chen Mengjia bases his statement entirely on Mircea Eliade's work Shamanism, Archaic Technique of Ecstasy, which is a work that was widely and severely criticized for making romantic overgeneralizations based on little or no archaeological evidence. So that might make us doubt into the very basis of this theory. As Mark Chandler pointed out, she wrote, I quote, "Of course, there is no requirement that a philosopher do anthropological fieldwork, but it is important that philosophical theories at least be consistent with the scientific evidence, particularly perhaps a theory calling itself anthropological ontology." And that is exactly why I believe that the comparison of Li's theory to the historically based theory by Xu Fuguan makes even more sense. So, as we can see, finally, the context of Xu's and Li's views on the position of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou are actually relatively similar. even though whether or not these early rulers should be also understood as shamans is debatable, the prominent role as political and religious leaders is undeniable. The exact role that Li and Shu attribute to these two kings, however, is somewhat less similar. The role he attributes to King Wen is much more active than the one attributed to him by Fuguan. While Li sees him as a pioneer of the rationalization of shamanistic practices, Shu understands him as the symbol of awakening of the humanistic spirit. So, in interpreting the role of the Duke of Zhou, we can note that Shu associates him primarily with the development of the concept of concerned consciousness, while Li exposes him mainly as a ruler who comprehensively established the institutional norms of ritual and music, which then served as the normative criteria of the social order of Chinese culture, also understood by Li as the culture of Zhou. So by comparing Li Zehou and Xu Fuguan, this article aimed to place Li's philosophical interpretation of the origin of Chinese culture in dialogue with Xu's historically grounded interpretation, and detached from the key elements of the theories and exact interpretation of the role or whatever of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, the implications of these differences among them, the differences between the interpretation as Chinese culture as an anxious or a joyful one. Even more important than that is that my analysis tried to point it out to the numerous differences between the work of a philosopher and a historian. And I believe that is a note that readers of Li Zehou and of course also of Xu Fuguan should definitely keep in mind when approaching their work. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Maja, for sharing with us your very vivid and insightful comparative study of Li's and Xu's philosophy. A very interesting and in many ways pertinent topic indeed. I must point out at that moment that apparently the panel number 5 is blessed with an almost inhumanely punctual and effective presenters. As a chair, I am very much obliged for such a high degree of academic chivalry. Thank you very much. So let's go to the last speaker. The subsequent and the last speaker of this panel is Professor Sydney Morrow. She is an assistant professor at the University of Central Oklahoma. She received her PhD from the University of Hawaii at Manoa in spring 2018. Her research interests include pre-Qin and Han Chinese philosophy, 20th century philosophy, applied and place-based philosophy, and comparative and cross-cultural philosophy. She is also an author of several articles and book chapters on related topics. The title of her today's speech will be I Demand a Recount, Li Zehou's reading of Kant's philosophy of mathematics. I am very much looking forward to listening to your lecture. Please, Professor Morrow, the chair is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I would like to first thank the organizers of the conference for their vision. This is amazing. I'm having a great time, and their patience and being so accommodating with me, and I'm sure everyone else. This is quite an event. And thank you to the moderator for keeping us moderated. So I really liked that Paul started off this panel the way that he did, because he put so many of the thoughts that I had but wasn't going to talk about into words. I picked up the English translation of Li Zehou's Critique of Critical Philosophy when it first came out in 2018, and just put it away and didn't really turn to it until pretty recently. And I'm sitting by myself in a room, this is real, going, what? No, what? And like Paul said, it sent me right back. Well, first I picked up the Critique of Pure Reason, and then I put it down, and then I picked up the Critique of Judgment, and I read the whole thing again. And so this is the result of that, going back, reflecting, and what started off as a feeling of just frustration, rejection. I thought Li Zehou was supposed to be a big deal. What is this? Now I see what he's trying to do and how he needed Kant to do it. And so that is the foundation of this presentation, this paper, which exists now. It didn't exist soon enough to be included in the papers distributed, but if you'd like to read it, it now exists. So I've divided my presentation into 3 sections. The first was my loudest exclamation was when Li Zehou talks about number. in his section on introducing Kant's epistemology. Very brief and very wrong. And then I'll go on a journey into Kant for just a little while. Why numbers count so much, why it's so important to get numbers right in order to make Kant's system even function, and then go back to Zehou and try to find where his fidelity is, where his fealty is to Kant, and where it's not. It ends up that if we're talking about the infinite, there's an awful lot that they have in common, and maybe by coring essentially Kant's philosophy of its most essential idea and putting something else in there, we end up with something sort of Frankenstein, but something that still kind of works. And that's where we'll end up. So again, we have Zehou is, well, I met him just a few times, but a humble guy. If you read his prefaces, especially to his English works, there are just apologies, and not in the Socrates sense, like just really sincere apologies. He writes that, let me make this bigger. This is from the preface. Historically, the task of appeasing Kant's philosophy has fallen to the Marxists, that everyone else is trying to move on, trying to come up with something new and different, or they're taking it all wholesale, and we're ending up with just book after book after book of just what Kant said. So we have from the very outset that Zehou isn't trying to provide us with yet another accurate academic account of Kant's philosophy. And I didn't read that first. I skip prefaces generally to get to the good stuff. And then when I went back, I said, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's pretty much what you did. Right? Gave us something new. We'll go straight to Zehou's brief mention of number. And this is all one paragraph, but I've divided it up into different parts. The first part being the most important, of course. I believe that the origin of numbers lies in primitive practical activities, that is, in primitive labor characterized by using and making tools. And this should come as no surprise, right? That anything that would become for Kant a priori, anything given, anything transcendental is going to have this historical materialist backing. But then he goes on to say that, and this is in more or less agreement with Kant, the origin of mathematics is not in external things, but an abstraction of subjected activities of sensibility. That is Kantian. That is very Kantian, as we will talk about. Of course, for those of you who read Kant, there's really not much to be said about external things at all. So Kant, even in his works, criticized any mathematics that hoped to place the theory fully external to human beings or fully internal, of course. All right, so the reason for my frustration, for those of you, and let me know if you just get dizzy from the going in and out, it's not a good idea, is that for Kant, numbers aren't practical. Numbers don't arise from given experience at all. Numbers are only a rule. Numbers are the schema of quantity. So again, schemas make the connection between the a priori ideas, understanding concepts, categories of understanding, and the manifold of sensible experience. There are what make judgments possible. And number is the first schema, the most important schema, the foundational schema for Kant. So again, number is a rule. Number, I mean, we can think of it, number is counting. For Kant, number is nothing other than counting. He doesn't really have much to say. A lot of academics have explored this idea of, does it mean ordinal number? Does it mean cardinal number? And they usually end up saying kind of both, but also neither, because number is a schema. Numbers make apperception of magnitude possible. And there is a modern scholarship trend coming about that makes all of Kant's philosophy essentially mathematical, which means that he's not merely talking about magnitude of objects as they're presented to our sense of like the size of things. He's talking about, in a manner of speaking, the size of ideas, the magnitude of ideas, big ideas, ideas that take you a little while to comprehend. So it's not merely the size of something, but the space, the amount of time it takes for you to think it, essentially. It connects a priori concepts and manifold experience. Number allows us to understand magnitude as the formation of a homogeneous unity. So basically in time, it is number that allows us to form the unity between our concept, our manifold of sensible experience, and root it into into our the formation of our consciousness through time. So the unit of sensible experience and the unit of the concept have to be the same. That's what it means by homogeneous. And then number allows those to be connected into one homogeneous unity. Although there's nothing limiting continued iteration of unities, which is apperception. So basically, although not every single content of every single judgment is numbered, it could potentially be, right? It's everything is potentially countable for Kant. And I lay all this out in my paper if you're like, what? No, already. Yes. But so we can continue to count for potentially ever, but we can't forever understand or we can't conceive of really, really, really large things. We can't count so high that we can count only as high as we can understand the magnitude of the unity. So basically we can keep counting, but eventually it's going to fall off the back when we are able to understand, right? We can only understand a certain size. When a unity becomes too large, remember this is all Kant, the judgment of its magnitude is no longer an epistemological judgment. It is a judgment, it's an aesthetic judgment. We become more fixated on the feeling of counting to such a high number than on the actual quantity that is subsumed by that number. Numbers are important for Kant. They're important both in the sense of making discrete unities that allow us to have judgments, and in the sense of combining those unities to form ever bigger unities, and eventually getting to what is beyond our ability to comprehend, which are aesthetic judgments, which require the ideas of the sublime, the moral, all the interesting stuff that I'm sure that you know about Kant if you know anything about Kant. So let's go back then to Zehou's brief mention of number. All that I've just discussed, he doesn't even mention. Number occurs in the whole book, the word number, like 4 times, and only one of them is even speaking about Kant's theory of number. So basically, we can only assume that what Zehou believes to be number is combined with all other a priori stuff. Like it's just sort of, it's a part of the catch-all of things for which he wants to change a priori from a transcendental idea to a sedimented idea. Okay. So now I'll go stepwise through what he preserves, right? Because at the outset, what I've given you is where I was when I started with, this is just inaccurate and wrong. How can he be an interpreter of Kant if he gets this so wrong? So first step, Lee interprets Kant's a priori concepts as sedimented ideas. And thankfully, we know all about sedimented ideas from the presentations thus far. So what I believe this says is that Kant hopes to maintain at least part of Kant's system, that he wants to maintain the idea of the a priori and somehow makes Kant's system work for him by replacing these sedimented ideas where Kant's a priori ideas occupy a place in the system. Because he said Kant deserves praise for doing this. And this is just one of those moments. Kant deserves praise for an a priori cultural psychological form of sedimentation of reason that is universal, sublime, and absolute. It's rooted in actual history. The reader would say, no, it's not. That can't be. But again, I'll start switching to the incredulousness, to the, well, right about now in my presentation. Because if we merely make the substitution that a priori ideas, concepts, categories could possibly have one more condition, right? They're supposed to be unconditioned for Kant. They don't have a cause that originates outside of themselves, like all these things. They have no condition. They simply exist, and then they cause, right? If there's one more condition back there, and it's this sedimented idea of the gradual creation, what difference does it make for Kant? Like, would it sunder the whole project? And I don't really think it does. It just changes it. The second point, Lee preserves the aesthetic basis of mathematics, but not the transcendental basis. So Lee writes, mathematics is a form of aesthetic intuition, but not related to Kant's a priori forms of intuition. So taking out the whole number system as synthetic a priori judgment. Nope, don't care. Going straight for aesthetic judgments. Lee says that the only reason that Kant has a theory of mathematics is to prove that his a priori synthesis idea is correct, that he doesn't really even care about philosophy of mathematics. He doesn't really engage with other philosophers, mathematicians at the time. He was just looking for a really convincing example of an a priori synthesis. So Lee discounts Kant's entire philosophy of mathematics in one fell swoop, but he does want to maintain this aesthetic basis of mathematics. And third, the idea of the infinite is a sedimented a priori idea. So even if we scrap the a priori synthesis, which contains the idea of ad infinitum counting, even if we can't conceive of it, we can still apprehend it, right? Even if we scrap that whole thing, if we keep aesthetic judgment, we keep the infinite. So the idea of the infinite is a sedimented a priori idea. Lee writes, infinity does not refer to things in the actual world, the infinity of objects, but rather to the idea that human beings can continue indefinitely or endlessly. This idea eventually developed because becomes an indispensable concept of mathematics. It is because people believe in infinity of the universe that human beings can carry on indefinitely. So can't find a condition for the infinite, can't find a way to root the idea, just say, well, people believe in it. And that's enough. Like they came to believe in it somehow. It was useful for them at some point in their making and using of tools and their material histories. So it must exist. I mean, so many philosophers are at great pains to to prove that the idea of the infinite exists. And here it is. And what this does, where the turn is for making Kant's philosophy work for Lee Zehou, is this right here, that in Kant, we have two ideas of the infinite. We have potential infinite, infinite counting, infinite iteration without ceasing, ad infinitum. But we also have the given infinitude of ideas of reason. And Kant is at pains to make these two work with each other. And mostly he doesn't. He divides them. Thank you. 1 minute left. By virtue of what sort of judgment is used to judge them, right? We have just a regular old judgment, right? Epistemological judgment, synthetic a priori synthesis. And then we have aesthetic judgment on the other hand. Lee scraps the more problematic one to keep the latter. Notably, Lee never criticizes Kant's theory of the sublime, which is the infinite given idea of the mathematically infinite, an idea of reason, but he doesn't dwell on it either. He goes right away to the connection between the sublime and moral ideas. He even calls them incomparably sublime moral ideas. And he writes, it is a fact that what is called sublime by us, this is Kant, having been prepared through culture, comes across as morally repellent to a person who is uncultured and lacking in development of moral ideas. Kant wrote that. Kant wrote that we can't understand the sublime, which is the infinitely mathematically given, unless we have culture, unless we have moral ideas. That one infinite idea, that is the moral law for Kant, is given as an infinite idea. Only once we have that can we understand the mathematically infinite idea of the sublime. So fans of Lee Zehou will say, whoa, smoking gun, look at that. Kant has just said that the root of infinite ideas lies in culture. And Lee plays this up in a big way. But Kant also writes this: the fact that a judgment about the sublime in nature requires culture still in no way implies that it was initially produced by culture and then introduced to society by way of, say, mere convention. This isn't in Lee Zehou's book. And so I think that Paul is exactly right, that Lee Zehou is a great philosopher, and that what he's done is he's used a bunch of tools from Kant, still under the auspices of retaining a lot of it, of making Kant's system work with all of his philosophy being a part of it. But ultimately, his grandest assertion is immediately undermined if you just read a little further. So intriguing, interesting, but ultimately just Lee Zehou being Lee Zehou, I guess, is where I'll end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morrow. Perfect timing again. I'm sure that it will come as no surprise that I'm not an expert on Lee Zehou, but your presentation was at least for me, extremely enticing. Now I think that I will have to read your chapter, definitely. So now let us proceed with the Q&A session. Are there any questions from the public? I think there are, but any questions? Please do raise your arm.
Yeah, if no one else is going to go, I'll step in. It's less of a question and more of a comment though, so apologies for being that guy. But this one's for Professor D'Ambrosio. Although I think it relates to Professor Morrow's line as well. I was just going to say, after Professor Nyland gave her talk a little earlier on, I went for a flick through an interview that Zehou did, and this one is an actual interview with a guy called Chen Ming, who is a professor here in Hunan and who I've met a couple of times. And he has a book which I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with. It's called Fuguan Lunxue, and it's just a series of dialogues that he has. And in it, he specifically talks, Professor Nyland was talking about Liu Xiaobo. And so I just went through flicking through to see what Li Zehou's kind of views of Liu Xiaobo was. And he criticizes him for being contradictory. He says there's a lot of 自相矛盾, and you could kind of ask him a few questions and he would immediately be stumped. And there's these like contradictions, and he kind of like writes off Liu Xiaobo and his enterprises as too radical. But then immediately afterwards, in this passage, which I'll send to you, Professor D'Ambrosio, if you're interested, because I think it's really relevant to your piece, he talks about the fact that you can't, like, the interviewer Chen Ming asks him about whether scholarship should be better regulated so that people like Liu Xiaobo aren't able to like say these contradictory things anymore. And he says in it, he says, 所以规范不要变成一种学术的框子或者是束缚。So if we're gonna regulate things, then we shouldn't we shouldn't be restrictive, but at the same time, we also shouldn't be allowing people like Liu Xiaobo to say things that are plainly contradictory. And he also says, 我觉得写理论文章的话，那好像自然科学就不遵守逻辑，制造一个炸弹，便会在过程中爆炸，那是含糊不得的。然后就说理论文章是一定要写的不自相矛盾的。So he has things like this to say. So and another thing that I found really interesting is he brings up the point of like 我注六经注我 immediately afterwards, which directly relates to your line about the commentary tradition. And he says 我们不能就是我注六经就要规范，但是六经注我 就不算，那就不对了。So it's interesting that even when he's saying like you're operating in this philosophical mode where it should be okay to mash together like art and history and literature like he does in Mei the Li Chang, you also need to have standards and you also need to be not self-contradictory. So just an interesting passage. I thought I would just kind of blurt all this out and get your reaction to it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for example, about contradictions, right? I think you can understand this broadly with, you know, what goes on in a lot of Chinese philosophy, a lot of philosophy in general, or just life in general, right? Everybody's contradictory, but some contradictions are not as good as others, right? And I think that's more of what he's getting at, right? Just like, for example, in the Analects, like, should you lie or pretend? No, of course not. But sometimes Confucius lies and pretends. Right. And I don't think you understand this like as a consequentialism. You just understand like in this case, it happens to be okay. In other cases, it's not okay. Right. So I think yeah, I think if you understand him as a philosopher more broadly, like you would take Confucius or Plato, then I think there's more room for that. And so I think similarly, for example, yeah, do articles still have a place, like academic articles? Yeah, of course. I mean, they're great training ground, right? We need this kind of thing. Francis Fukuyama, for example, has asked how he can be so broad, right, in his writing and things like this. And he says, like, yeah, the academic system sort of beats it out of you, but a lot of that buildup is still very good, right? So I think if we don't take this in terms of, should we establish some sort of standard? Yeah, I mean, there needs to be something, but should that be the only thing, right? Or like, how loosely do we Jing and Tren, right? The Jing can be a standard, but we still need to trend it all the time, right? So I think that's one way to approach it.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm reacting to the background there. It looks like a very comfortable scene that you've got yourself in there. Yeah, so I guess like you were saying, there are different contradictions, and kind of maybe because he is so broad as well, it's just like he has a bit more latitude to pick and choose which are the contradictions that matter and which are the ones that don't, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I think we do this all the time, right? Like we all lie, we all pretend, we all, do all these things. It's just like which ones matter, right? So I think, yeah, there's contradictions everywhere, but which ones matter, right? Which ones do we accept and which ones do we not accept? And I think, again, I just think the danger, right? Like Confucius warns, right? People who are always sin, those people are dangerous, actually, right? Like the people who hold on to it too tightly and don't engage whatever and do or Jingquan sort of processes. Because ultimately, I think, like Confucius, right, with Li Zehou, he identifies things as complicated, right? And like things are complicated, we can't have one approach to all things. And so he's asking you to reflect on things, not giving you a solution to specific problems.
Okay, now we can go to Professor Roschker, who raised her hand.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. I would just now add some more water to this contradiction discussion and to the discussion of Li Zehou as a philosopher and being unable to be an academic scholar, but being a very fascinating philosopher, and also regarding his own contradictions. I mean, his texts are full of contradictions or things that appear to us as contradictions. Now, first of all, I think that especially that we have to bear when we are dealing with philosophy and when we want to get some new insights, philosophical insights also, then it is very important that we bear with contradictions, because without contradiction, if everything is resolved, then we cannot learn or think about anything else. It is only the contradictions which can bring to us a certain tension that can lead to some new ideas or new insights. Besides, we even more have to bear with contradictions if we are studying Chinese philosophy, because I mean, I've said that a million times already today, but it is a processual philosophy, and many things that appear as a contradiction, as something that is impossible, does from these static paradigms of being does not appear as a contradiction anymore, and it's pretty good, understandable, and very clear from the viewpoint of processual paradigms. And also, I think that only in this way we can really avoid to remain limited, to this ivory tower of academic philosophy, which I also I don't call it philosophy, I call it philosophology. You know, not a discipline, not a theory of knowledge, but theory about the theory of about the love of wisdom. Yeah, now I have lost my thread, but I have another thing to say. You must excuse me, I've been sitting here from before 8 o'clock in the morning, and I just cannot imagine Roger Ames. He has been sitting here with us all the night. I mean, that's just incredible. Okay, but just another idea I had when I was listening, Sydney, to your presentation. Unlike you, I was, of course, I'm not working on the Kant's theories of numbers for many years already. I could not read your written text because it was sent to us only two days ago or something. But I have listened with great interest to your recording. And then just an idea popped out in my head that Zehou, being a philosopher, but a philosopher in a Chinese tradition which does not have this, this requirement to explain everything in detail or to make a systematic theory out of everything like Kant. So, and it is, you have showed very clearly and very brilliantly, actually, how this really differs from the Kantian conceptions of numbers, which are basically rules that can make synthetic a priori judgments possible. And then, in the light of this, paradigm, Zehou's actually idea about numbers, even if we put them into this scene of the transformation of empirical into the transcendental, it still remains somehow, well, it is not a rule, it is not a concrete number, what the hell is it actually? And then I was but this is just an initial inspiration. I will not be able to develop it much farther now, but I will write to you. I will add it to the comments I had to your recording also. What if for Zehou, for instance, or if we somehow try to connect him to certain traditions of the Moist or the nominalist school of the Chinese logicians, what if what he had in the background of in the back of his brain unconsciously was the idea that numbers can be, conveyed, carried forward, sedimented as patterns, not as concrete numbers, not as rules, but as patterns, as Li. I was talking about this with Bobby earlier in this conference already, so I'm also not going to repeat myself, but it is just an idea that popped up in my mind. Maybe you can also comment on this.
No, I would love to include something about what Li has in mind from the Chinese historical philosophical tradition, because he has something. I think he has something there that we don't find much mention of number in Chinese philosophy. But like you said, we do have this idea of pattern. We definitely have an idea of quantity, a very interesting, I think, idea of what quantity might be, which could be applied. So yes, I started on the same journey. I started the journey at the same place as you. What the heck does he think this is then? And in my talk, I go on and on. It's not a rule because it's something more material than a rule. but it's not, it can't go completely into the a priori bucket, because it isn't sedimented, it's still active, it's still doing. But the idea of a pattern,
it's also basically changing. It's also dynamic. No, I would just like to add that I don't think that there are no discourses or no theories about numbers in the Chinese tradition, because, for instance, Malin, she has done a lot. I don't know if you know her. She has been participating at 1 or 2 symposia in Ljubljana, and she was always presenting some of her works on traditional Chinese mathematics. And there, and she was presenting some theories of numbers that were different. And maybe this has also, maybe you should look into this also. And if you will continue to work on Zehou, then that could be maybe some help. But if not, you can maybe even connect it more directly, to a broader issue of Chinese mathematics and Kant's theory of mathematics. Just an idea again.
Thank you.
I would like to add here that maybe Christopher Cullen's overview of history of mathematics might come in handy, or Alexei Volkov's studies on analytical reasoning and analytical proof in mathematics. So there is a lot of material currently available for use. There is an entire branch of history of mathematics in China.
Yes, Jan is working actually on the history of analytic philosophy, science, and mathematics in China. So I think you two should definitely connect with each other.
Okay, but
Excellent.
Let's leave it for external connections. Any other questions? We've still got, I think, 20 minutes to go. Maybe we should also include Maja into discussion.
Jordan, there is also Jordan.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question for Maja. I wanted to, I'm sorry, Maja, just wanted to throw one out to Professors Morrow and Roshka, as it just occurred to me as the discussion was happening just then. How much of Professor Morrow's issue do you think we can attribute just to the fact that, as many of the papers in this conference have noted, Zehou had this very different idea of what the transcendental was, of what like transcendental actually means. To me, it kind of seems like it comes from a difference between transcendental in the Western philosophical tradition and then just the everyday usage of the word xianyan in Chinese. I think a lot of it is this all just a subset of that problem? Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out. Is it just that problem cropping up, but here specifically with regard to number?
I don't think so. I think that he says synthetic a priori judgments about the mathematical aren't possible. So it's not, I think it goes beyond just, he does say several times that it's not transcendental, but he goes through and systematically as he gets. And then he'll have this proof about how mathematics isn't a synthetic a priori judgment. And then he'll say, so Kant is wrong about that. And then he'll go on. So I think he really did, he really wanted to prove, I think, that mathematics can only be understood as an aesthetic judgment. And so I think he did maintain Kant's version of the transcendental in this work, in this little part. Elsewhere in the book, you're absolutely right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. May I just add a little bit of something? I think precisely this phraseology is very chaotic on this regarding this transcendental of the empirical transformation of the empirical into the transcendental, because when he talks about it in English, he always formulates it in that way, the transformation of empirical into the transcendental. But if he write about it in Chinese, he uses he uses the word xianyan, although xianyan is actually the usual Chinese translation of a priori. And the usual Chinese translation of transcendental is chaoyuan, actually, and not xianyan. So I have originally also in my book, I don't know, first or second on Li Zehou, I have put this into the footnote with the question somehow that maybe he wasn't very clear about the meanings of this or the differences of this concept, and then Li Zehou read it and he said, well, these are very, very elementary philosophical expressions and terms, and of course, a second great philosophy student knows the difference. And then I told him, yes, but maybe the problem was in the translation. You know, that he understood it in Chinese in one way, but then in English in a different way. I mean, and we have to add that in Chinese, there is a very chaotic usage of xianyan and xiantian or chaoyan, all these three expressions. So it is, we must always be very cautious about it when we read texts that apply these three expressions. But this might just be one of the maudun, contradictions we have to bear with.
I think you should move it out of the footnote and into the body, write a whole chapter on it.
It's published already. Roger.
Just following what Jana has been saying, that really has given us a bit of a problem, and that is that in the second half of the 19th century, what we know is that East Asia created a new language using Chinese characters, but translating Western modernity into an Asian language. And so, of course, that's going to be sort of a source. I teach at Beida we teach Lun Li Xue, we teach Zhe Xue, we teach Luo Ji, the whole framework of Western education, the curriculum, is a Western framework. Okay, so that's sort of a starting point. But sort of following up behind Jana, when Buddhism comes into China, Buddhism certainly transforms the Confucian tradition, but the Confucian tradition also produces its own Buddhism. Chan, Sanlun, Huayan. These are not Indian Buddhism. This is something that has been filtered through the I Ching kind of, the cosmology that's made explicit in the Dazhuan, I Ching Dazhuan. Same thing when you think of Marxism, like what we're talking about, with Maja and Sid and Paul, we're talking about sort of distortion. So Marxism becomes something that is historicist. It loses its theoretical, it loses any kind of economic principle. It becomes something very Chinese. And so the same thing is happening with the language of Western modernity. The word chaoyue was introduced in order to translate a concept of transcendent that is supposed to equate with a Platonic notion of transcendent, or a theological concept of a transcendent God, a self-sufficient, the aseity of God, a perfect God. Pubian is introduced in order to translate a Western concept of universal, which is a very strict notion of universal, something that is outside of time and space.
Yeah.
But now all of this language is being used to express a decidedly Confucian worldview. And so there's a confusion in there that is really challenging. It's the question is, are we reading what they're saying in English, or are we reading what they're saying in Chinese?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is also just a short remark to Roger's remark. This is also, for instance, the problem you have articulated also in your critique of the concept of immanent transcendence in Mo Zong-san, in one of your books, and I think it was together with David Hall or Henry Rosman, but there was a critique in this sense. It was so, it was a contradiction viewing from the Western point of view, but then, you know, from the Confucian point of view, maybe it's not.
No, it's
So what are we going to do with this issue?
Well, I think we muddle along.
Okay, very philosophically. We will muddle along. Like real philosophers, right? Not as academic philosophers. No. Okay.
Okay. No more question left. I think that the line of discussion has been exhausted. So if there are really no more questions, I would suggest that we move on with the program. Do you agree, Professor Roschke?
You are the chair, Jan. You have to decide.
We are 10 minutes earlier.
I would maybe only say that regarding Maja, because we have not discussed Maja's paper yet, but I think that I have listened to a more rough version of her paper at the summer school. And I can only say, I mean, I'm not going to comment extensively on her paper because we are both in Ljubljana and we will discuss that issues several times anyway. But I would just like to say that as her supervisor, I think that the elaboration from this rough version that was presented at the summer school and to this new version is really good. It is, I think, a step forward, and I liked it a lot. I still have a lot of comments, Maja, but yeah, we'll do it face to face then. But as a whole, I think it is really a very good step forward. Do you agree, Paul?
Yeah, I actually read her paper, and like we talked, I think Maja, I don't remember, did we talk about it on Zoom, or I gave you comments and we
gave me comments, yes, and then we talked online.
Yeah. I think it's really good. And so I sort of feel weird, not for the same reasons as Jana, but because I gave the comment, so I feel sort of like fake, you know, like then saying like, oh, I have a question when I already talked about it.
I also gave her my comments already.
Yeah.
But we haven't spoken
are
about.
Not included in the presentation yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah. The upgrade from the summer school is mostly due to the really helpful comments that Paul and Bobby gave me after my presentation in Ljubljana. So I try to incorporate that. The ones that are coming in now from Jana and from Paul will be integrated for the SUNY article, hopefully. Thank you.
Very well.
One point on Fuguan is Fuguan. I mean, his language is the most beautiful Chinese. If everybody wrote like Fuguan, you know, then we would be in great shape. When I began my PhD at the University of London, I read a 40-page paper by Fuguan on the political philosophy of the Huainanzi. And then I set that aside and I worked on my dissertation for 3 years and wrote this big fat dissertation, went back and read Fuguan and discovered that I had said nothing more than he had said in 40 pages. You know, Fuguan is really somebody to take very, very seriously. He's historical. I mean, he has a sense of history that a lot of these other philosophers don't have. But there's also he's also penetrating. You know, he reads the whole. He doesn't read the first 2 chapters of Huainanzi and talk about Huainanzi. He reads the whole damn book. You know, so he really is somebody to take very seriously.
I'm still kind of struggling with all the quotations from all the classical works that, of course, he read and used. But yeah, I'm kind of hoping for a conference dedicated to Fuguan as well in the future years.
Okay, so I think we should wrap it up here. Thank you very much for all the speakers. Thank you for being so terse and so timely. I really enjoyed all 3 papers. I'm especially personally interested in Professor Morrow's paper, and I hope that we will have an external communication on the issues relating to her paper. And now I suggest that we move on to the panel number 6, which will be chaired by Professor D'Ambrosio. Thank you very much.